Good afternoon. Welcome to the 17th Columbia Business School Real Estate Symposium. I lost count somewhere around 12. It's great to be back on Manhattanville campus, and it's great on a personal level to see so many old friends and students and just to have the opportunity to schmooze. Most of you or many of you already know me, but for those who don't, my name is David Sherman. I'm the industry co-director at the Milstein Center, a graduate of Columbia Business School in 1982, an adjunct professor and a founding member of the Real Estate Circle. My main job at the center is outward focused, working with our alumni around the world and connecting us to industry. In that job, I bring alumni into the classroom, I meet with alumni around the country, I run monthly market update calls where alumni share ideas on the market, a whole host of different ways to engage. And what I found over the last 6 or 7 years is that we have an amazing alumni base. We have over 3,000 people, we think, working in real estate around the world in different aspects of the business. We've identified about 2,000 of them, and we're speculating on the remaining 1,000. We have people in every market, in every part of the business, from young associates up to CEOs. It's a tremendous community and it's a tremendous resource. And that's why I love the symposium so much. This is the only conference that we do or participate in that is done exclusively by alumni for alumni. So this is a Columbia event. As always, we're going to have a mix of faculty, industry leaders, talking about timely topics, giving you new ideas. We're going to have more networking opportunities than we had 2 or 3 years ago. We continue to add more. And this will be, as it always is, a unique, small, just fun event. The way we create this every year, which it's hosted by the Circle, we then set up an alumni committee that effectively creates the agenda. We have 2 co-chairs, and we rotate them every other year. So if you're a co-chair this year, you're going to be a co-chair next year. Next year, we'll have somebody new. That person will stay 1 more year. And that's the way we have continuity. But the group is typically 10 to 12 alumni who start in summer and spend a tremendous amount of time thinking about what topics are current and timely and interesting, and what direction do we want to take the agenda for this year. And as always, I think this year we have an absolutely fabulous agenda. The 2 Circle leaders that are our co-chairs, Katie Pelsar and Anise Lung, you'll hear from both of them later. And I'll tell you about the entire committee, but not till after we're done. Before we start the program, I want to give you a brief update on our activities in the center and in the program. Enrollment across all of our real estate courses was constant from last year at about 900 seats occupied. So if a student takes 1 real estate class, counts as 1. If somebody takes 2 real estate courses, counts as 2. But 900 is roughly double where we were when I started in this job. So we've had great growth. We continue to update and enhance the courses that we offer. We added a course called Business and Climate Change, put together by Assistant Professor Perry Sastry. The Real Estate Development course was redesigned by Adjunct Professor Ben Atkins. Andrew Jacobs, you still here? In the back? Andrew retired after having set the record as an adjunct professor. And Jane Yang, class of 2009, will be reintroducing the Capstone Project class this spring. We have 2 very exciting new funds that were set up to support student experiential initiatives. Domestic Treks, international travel, domestic travel, case competitions, and that support allows our students to do more things off campus and out of the community or out of the classroom that really help their learning. So That's been a great development. The Milstein Center partnered with the Hub at Columbia, our Columbia think tank, to host a small invitational-only summit looking at a multidisciplinary path forward for New York City. We had government people, faculty, industry leaders get together and just share ideas on what would policy look like that makes sense. That led to a white paper, The Future of New York City Real Estate. In terms of alumni engagement, we continue to engage more alumni in more ways every year. For those of you who were part of the circle 6, 7, 8 years ago, you would have participated in 2, maybe 3 events a year, including the Symposium. This past year, we ran 24 circle events. We've increased the membership from roughly 40 to 130. We engage regularly with another 250 alum who participate in our circle events as guests. So we've made a great outreach and inroads into the community, but there's still a lot left to do given our 3,000 alumni. If you are not already a circle member, you're missing out on an opportunity for both networking and thought leadership. It's more useful and beneficial than it was at any time in the last 20 years, given what we're doing with the circle. Ask any staff member you see how you can join the circle. Now, a few logistical items. The conference is going to take place today between the 1st and the 3rd floor. All the sessions are going to be right here in this room, and the networking and refreshment breaks are going to be on 3 where we had lunch. There are lots of volunteers around, student and staff volunteers. Ask if you have any questions. We'll have a refreshment break on 3 midway through the conference. If you need to make a call or step out, on the other side of the turnstiles, there's a great coffee area, good place for making calls. We're going to end the day at 5:30 with cocktails. Hope everybody stays for cocktails. Now, without further ado and delay, let me introduce my partner, faculty co-director Stijn Van Nieuwerburgh, and Hugh Frater, who are going to have a wonderful discussion on the state of the U.S. housing market. Stijn and Hugh, thank you very much. Welcome.
Thank you so much, David, and welcome to all of you. My name is Stijn Van Nieuwerburgh. I'm the co-director of the Milstein Center, mostly focused on the internal affairs, academic affairs, and very happy to welcome Hugh Frater with us today for our first session of the day, which is going to be about housing policy. Where are we on the housing market? And this is a really interesting time to think about housing because, first of all, for the first time in living memory, both presidential candidates in October and November were routinely discussing housing policy. We have a new incoming Trump administration that I think has some bold plans for where to take housing, which we'll touch upon. And then sort of longer run, there's clearly challenges in, for our economy to provide enough housing given sort of the state of the housing affordability problem. And I'm glad to say that today we really have the perfect guest. Hugh Frater is an expert in housing finance, and equally important, has a passion for the topic, as I'm sure you'll notice in our conversation. By way of background, for those of you who don't know Hugh's had a storied career in housing and in real estate more broadly. He was a founding partner at BlackRock. He was a CEO of Berkadia, a commercial real estate services firm. He was the CEO of Fannie Mae from 2018 to 2022, and we'll touch upon the state of the GSEs. So at Fannie Mae, he set the strategic direction, guided the company through the pandemic, which was a very challenging time for housing markets, and was a champion of initiatives to make access to housing more equitable. Currently, he's the board chairman of Vessel Technologies. We'll talk a little bit about Vessel towards the end of our conversation. And let me also mention that he's a board member of the Bipartisan Policy Center and an advisory board member at the Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center. And most importantly, from our perspective, he's a member of the Columbia Real Estate Forum and a member of the Board of Overseers of our business school. And he's an alum of our program class, CBS class of 1985. So welcome, Hugh. So I thought that it would be useful to begin this session with a very short couple of slides to level set the discussion and to sort of see where we are on some basic statistics of the housing market. Okay, so let me quickly run through a few of these things before we'll turn it over to Hugh. So we're coming off a really remarkable period of house price growth in the United States, where we've had 5% growth every year after the financial crisis up until 2020, when house price growth dramatically accelerated. And we had this 2-year period from April 2020 to April 2022, where house prices grew by 40%, probably the fastest ever in American history. That was then followed by the Fed raising interest rates, cooling down house price growth. It never went negative. House prices never fell. And house price growth is now perking back up a little bit. It's running at around 3% per year. Now, one of the reasons why we've had such strong house price growth is that we've had very limited new housing supply. Right? So this chart shows housing supply all the way back to the 1960s. And you can see that we produced most housing in this country back in the 70s. We also had a lot of construction in the mid-2000s. But then following the great financial crisis, construction really dropped off, and we had about a 15-year period where we really undersupplied the housing market, both in the single family and the multifamily side. Very recently, we've had a couple of strong years of multifamily construction in particular. That's the yellow area. You can see that. Last quarter, in fact, was the quarter where we produced the most new multifamily housing units in the last 50 years. But already the pipeline, the new construction pipeline, is slowing on the back of higher interest rates, right? And so make no mistake about it, we are still undersupplying housing. This chart, which we'll come back to, shows that very clearly. It shows new housing construction relative to population, right? And whereas we were building something like 12 housing units per 1,000 people in the United States, before the financial crisis, that number, dropped off to like 5 or 6. It's still 50% below where we were before the pandemic today, right? So we also have very low inventory, even though the inventory situation has improved a little bit. There's only 4 months worth of housing for sale, whereas 6 months is more normal. And so all of that has led to what we call the housing affordability crisis. So when people talk about housing affordability, what do they mean? Well, we have to distinguish between owners and renters, right? So for owners, we say that housing is unaffordable when house prices are high relative to a notion of fundamentals. So that fundamental could be household income, right? So this chart shows that house prices are high and have been growing relative to income coming out of the financial crisis. Also relative to cash flows, relative to rents, house prices have been rising substantially over the last 10 plus years. And finally, since most housing is financed with mortgage debt, we talk about housing being unaffordable when homeowners spend a large share of their income on the mortgage debt service, right? So what this chart shows us is that the gray line here takes a typical homeowner who takes an 80% LTV mortgage, 30-year fixed rate mortgage at whatever the current interest rate is, makes median income, buys the median house. What's the share of income that household is spending on their mortgage debt service? Right? So the gray line shows us that right now that's about 30% of income. It was even higher. It was 35% of income a couple of years ago, a year or so ago. So housing affordability has improved slightly from that perspective in the last year or so, but it's much higher than it was for much of the last decade, right? So that's one sense in which housing has become much less affordable. Now, on the renter side, housing affordability is usually defined relative what share of rent do people spend on income, what share of income do people spend on rent. And renters are called rent burdened when they spend more than 30% of their income on rent. And what we see here in this chart is that there's about 22 million rent burdened households in America, which is about half of all the renters, right? There's sort of a further stage of hell, which is severely rent burdened, where you're spending more than half of your income on rent. And we see that about half of these rent burdened households are in fact severely rent burdened. That rent burden is geographically omnipresent, although it is worse on the coast. It's actually recently also worse in places like Texas and Florida. And it's much worse amongst low-income households, obviously, naturally. And furthermore, the rent burden has been increasing over time. The problem has been getting worse. And if you look at that top right chart, what that tells you is that renters are left over with a lot less cash than they used to have after paying rent, right? And so that sort of feeds into this more general financial fragility that a lot of the poorest renter households have, where they have really very little liquid resources to buffer a shock like a medical emergency, for example, right? And so let me then finally sort of connect these two pieces together, the ownership piece and the renter piece. Because house prices are so high, because mortgage interest rates are so high, housing has become so unaffordable. A lot of people that would have transitioned from renting into owning are now basically becoming, I don't want to say permanent renters, but long-term renters, and that puts further pressure on the already unaffordable rental market, right? And so that's sort of the background that I wanted to share with you before we talk about the situation with Hugh. So Hugh, my first question for you is, what do you make of these facts, and how did the housing affordability situation get sort of as bad as it is today?
Well, thank you, Stan, for that excellent introduction, and it's great to be back. I did get an opportunity to visit the ironically named Hugh Frater study room over in the other building before this. But going back to this chart, this is a useful one to look at to tell the story. I credit this chart to my old friend Doug Duncan, who's the former chief economist of Fannie Mae. And the blue lines are home prices. That's the FHFA housing index, and the red lines are single family housing starts, and the gray bars are recessions. And this is a chart that economists love because the market sends a price signal, and the market responds by adding supply at varying rates. And the relationship between prices and starts, the relationship between the blue line and the red line has been very, very consistent until it wasn't. And so you see coming into just to the center of the chart, you see that wide gray bar. That was the great financial crisis. Remember, this is a housing-led recession. That's why you see that price in that starts line declining dramatically leading into the recession. But the width of that gray bar just tells you how deep the recession was and how deep the demand destruction was. But as you move forward over time from towards the right-hand side of the chart, that relationship is severed or is fundamentally changed in some way. The market is not responding to the price signals in the way that it had before. So there's at least 5 different things going on this chart, and I think I can remember most of them. The first is that going forward out of the great financial crisis, our ability to deliver housing was fundamentally impaired. So what was happening in the builder space? They were faced with massive overhang from inventory that didn't sell, from foreclosures. I think Fannie and Freddie between them foreclosed on 6 million homes during that period of time. They had severe tightening of credit standards for land acquisition and for construction finance, severely straining their resources and their capital ratios. You had, as a consequence of all of this, you had bankruptcy and supply chain destruction. From 2007 to 2012, 50% of the builders in the United States left the business voluntarily or involuntarily. Over 2.2 million workers left the construction trades. So our ability to deliver housing was fundamentally impaired. Another thing that's interesting, this is really important for policymakers to remember. So if you look just to the right of the gray recession bar, like in 2009, you'll see a sharp spike in home prices. That's the 2009 first-time home buyer tax credit. So all things being equal, if you add demand, prices go up. And when the sugar high runs out and the glucose is gone from your body, prices come back down. So it's really important to remember that as we think about how, from a policy point of view, to solve this problem. The third thing going on is that the story of housing supply is not only about new housing starts. In fact, it's as much or more about existing inventory. So in any given year, 90+% of home sales are typically existing homes, not new homes. You add new homes in places that are growing rapidly to fill gaps where they're needed, but most of the action is in existing inventory. And who owns the existing inventory? So 40% of the homes in the United States, I think that's about 35 million, Stan can help me on the math here, but 40% of those homes are owned by the second largest generation, which is the baby boomers. And during this period of time, what preference have the baby boomers been expressing? Well, 90% of them want to age in place. And 60% of them, I think that's about 21 million homes, 60% of them never want to sell their homes. So obviously biology will take care of that eventually, but right now, that's inventory that's not available. And so that's simply another supply constraint. Fourth, and always inescapable, demographics. So what else was happening during this period of time? the largest generation, millennials, were entering the sweet spot of household formation and therefore housing demand. You see that how that blue line rapidly starts accelerating in 2012, and it keeps going up. Well, what that is the millennials forming households. From 2012 to today, the home ownership rate for millennials has gone from 33% to 55%, the largest single driver of demand. So if you add demand in the face of constrained or inelastic supply, what happens? Prices go, anyone? Ben Schwartz? Prices go up. So that's what was happening. And there was another demographic factor sort of expressing itself in the housing markets during this time, which is declining marriage rates, the rise of single-head households, and there are now more single-head households than ever before in our country. And that simply adds to unit demand. And then finally, the cherry on top, you'll notice that thin gray recession line on the right, followed by a shockingly large increase in prices. Well, that's COVID-19. So you add massive demand-side stimulus in the form of direct transfer payments to consumers. You add massive monetary easing by the Fed. You add work from home. You add a flight from the cities to thinly supplied suburban and rural areas, unlike anything we've seen since the 70s. You add demand-side stimuli, constrained and inelastic supply, prices go up. There was a period of time during the pandemic, this is just a fun fact, the fastest appreciating home markets in the United States all began with the letter B. Boulder, Colorado, Bend, Oregon, Boise, Idaho, and Bozeman, Montana, expressing that desire to flee the cities. Obviously, then things readjusted when the Fed started tightening, and after all, the demand-side stimuli ran out. But this is a really good sort of way to think about all the different things that interact in the housing market and how and what some of the potential policy solutions are. I look at this picture and I kind of think, well, we understand what happened during this period, and this sort of very interesting period since the Great Financial Crisis is said to account for as much as 2 million of our shortage of houses in this country. But it's not actually a new problem. And what got us here and what can we do about it? From a policy point of view, people are really finally starting to, the pennies dropped and they're kind of coalescing around, geez, I guess we need to add supply. But I've learned that the housing advocacy community, the housers in general, as they're called, are a very fractious bunch. They have really strongly held opinions about everything, and it kind of reminds me of what Charles de Gaulle said about the challenge of managing France. It's impossible to govern a country that has 300 different types of cheese. And all kidding aside, I mean that's fundamentally the problem. Housing is a national or statewide issue with local and even hyperlocal solutions, and I think that's the truth that's embedded in the charts that we're looking. So if we go back one to this one, if you look at this chart, and if you looked at this on a per capita basis, I believe these are nominal. If you look back at it per capita, what you'd find is for the last 60 years, we've been supplying less and less housing per capita. So in 1960, at the beginning of back to the
one is per capita,
yeah, that one's. If you go back to the other one, thanks. 1960, which is where I think this one begins, the population of the United States was 180 million. Today, it's 330 million. We have been supplying less and less housing over this entire period of time in the face of a growing need. I mean, why on earth would we do that? So if you had to come up with a single word, my single word would be zoning. Somebody else might say NIMBY, not in my backyard. Other people might say regulation writ large. But the reality is that something fundamental has been happening that has driven this declining rate of production.
Let's talk a little bit about the zoning piece of that. What's the background here for those of maybe there's some international students here that may not be aware of sort of the background to this. So tell us a little more about that.
So if you took the 300 types of cheese and multiplied it by 100, that would give you the estimated number of separate zoning codes in the United States, according to Sarah Bronin's National Zoning Atlas. That's 30,000 different zoning codes. So that's 30,000 different ways to encourage responsible land use, meaning you can't site a chemical plant next to a school, or said differently, that's 30,000 different ways to stop housing from being built. New York City enacted the first comprehensive zoning code in 1916. In 1924, it was the State Standard Zoning Enabling Act of 1924 that basically set the stage for the devolution of zoning from federal to state to local levels. All states had adopted some version of that by the 1930s. And the vast majority of zoning, of those 30,000 zoning codes, are what's called Euclidean zoning, not named after Euclid the mathematician, but named after a Supreme Court case in 1926, the town of Euclid, Ohio, versus Ambler. And today it's estimated, and what that decision confirmed was that use-based zoning is constitutional. So the use of the piece of land is defined in the zoning code. It is zoned as single family, it's zoned as industrial, it's zoned as commercial, and so on. It's estimated that 75% of all privately held land in the United States today is zoned single family residential only. And that obviously is an inhibitor to adding zoning, whether you wanted to put up an apartment building or a triplex or an ADU or whatever it might be. That's a significant factor that limits the creation of supply. 99% of the time, if you buy a single-family lot and you want to build a single-family house on it, you submit your plans, and if they conform to code, you get approved. 99% of the time, if you want to build an apartment building, you have to have a public hearing. So why is that? Well, it was hiding in plain sight, actually, in the language of the Euclid decision, and I'll read it for you if you're interested. Well, I'm going to read it anyway. It said, very often the apartment house is a mere parasite on single-family neighborhoods, one whose predation will persist until finally the residential character of the neighborhood and its desirability as a place of detached residences is utterly destroyed.
Ouch. That's
from Euclid, Ohio versus Ambler in 1926. So it was obvious that there was a bias in favor of single-family versus more density, and that problem has been with us for a while. If anybody is more interested in this topic, I would recommend reading a book by Richard Rothstein called The Color of Law, which talks about the history of racial exclusion in federal housing policy. But in any event, the net result is that a tiny handful of dedicated, hardworking, I think well-intentioned people typically control the decision as to whether or not the residents of their community are properly housed. And typically the people that need that housing the most are not represented in those meetings, and the people that do show up at those meetings, which are typically 7 to 10 and, on a Wednesday evening, are older, wealthier people who want to protect their interests, understandably. But there's some absolutely laughable examples of hypocrisy in this space. I mean, hypocrisy is a word that doesn't have much meaning anymore, I guess. But there are wealthy venture capitalists that will go on and on about the need to create more housing in this country, and those same wealthy venture capitalists will show up at a zoning commission meeting to vociferously protest the creation of new housing. The good news is, and there actually is good news, that this is recognized as a bipartisan problem in need of bipartisan solutions. States as different as Florida and Connecticut, Montana, and California have enacted sweeping housing legislation that has taken back some of that power from local zoning commissions back to the state level where it belongs. The Mercator Center at GW estimated that as of July of this year, there were 263 separate pieces of state housing legislation in play around the country. It is on the ballot everywhere, and the good news is the momentum is continuing. There are bipartisan organizations like Up for Growth, which everybody should take a look at, which are working hard to shine a light on this issue in the halls of Congress and also at the state level. There are left-leaning advocacy groups like YIMBY Action, which now has chapters, I think, in 54 chapters in 23 states. Thanks to the good work of Up for Growth and others, there was a YIMBY caucus that actually formed in Congress within the last month, bipartisan. The bipartisan YIMBY Act is working its way through committees in the House and the Senate right now. And what that act calls for is if you're a recipient of HUD community block development grants, you have to give a report every year on what the state of your zoning reform is and how what changes you are making to enable more density. It's a small step, but it's a step in the right direction. The conservative think tank, the American Enterprise Institute, has been going from state to state pitching what they call the housing abundance success sequence, which is a fancy way to say zoning reform, but what they call for in that is as-of-right zoning, increased density in walkable and amenity-rich areas, simpler land use, faster permitting, less onerous building requirements, and they estimate that those, if that success sequence, as they describe it, was adopted nationally, it would add 2% a year to stock, or said differently, 30 to 40% of additional production without government subsidies.
So some of it is maybe elevating the level of decision power from the very local level to the state level. Some of it is simplify sort of best practices around the country, right, and sort of showing maybe having a playbook. And then some of it, it seems to may potentially be using the federal lever. So that's sort of an interesting question. What is the federal government able to do in this world where states' rights and
well, the good news is right now the sort of United States is a giant zoning lab. I mean, they're trying new things all the time, learning things all the time. It turns out that one of the big things, if you're sort of near transit, is eliminating parking requirements. There are lessons learned, like Minneapolis got rid of single-family zoning, but they didn't change the floor area ratio, so it didn't increase density. That seems like a simple miss, but in any event, we're learning a lot every day. The feds do have a role to play, and I think the action's probably more at the state level than at the federal level, but the federal level can be influential. And so during the Biden administration, what they have been doing is providing grants, block grants to states to help them study zoning reform, to help them implement zoning reform. There's precedent, obviously. Everybody here has probably heard of an organization called Mothers Against Drunk Driving that were instrumental in the movement to change the drinking age from 18 to 21. But what actually got it over the goal line was when in the 80s, the federal government said, if you don't change your drinking age, they said to the states, if you don't change your drinking age from 18 to 21, we're not going to give you highway trust fund money. And so they basically took the hammer out and banged them over the head, and everybody changed the drinking age to 21. It may get to that point in the housing markets, but it'll be a bit more complicated. But the federal government does have a role to play.
Be allocating some HUD monies according to.
It could be HUD money. It could be, if they had some guts, it could be low-income housing tax credits or other tax credits. It remains to be seen. But I do think there's a role for the feds, but it's largely will have to happen, certainly from an implementation point of view at the state level.
One more question, coming back for one more second to the zoning piece, right? So I think Republicans are not known to be sort of very much in favor of federal government infringement on their local rights. Can you imagine sort of a lot of resistance against forcing multifamily housing in, let's call it, Republican suburbs? How do you think that will play out?
I think it's an interesting. President-elect Trump has changed his mind on this topic a couple times. Back in 2020, he and Ben Carson penned an op-ed where they said words to the effect that the movement to densify and change single-family zoning is really just a plot by the libs to destroy the Republican suburbs. Earlier this year, a couple months ago, he, in an interview with Bloomberg, said, zoning's an absolute killer. We've got to do something about it. I've been a developer my whole life, and we're going to add more housing. We're going to get the cost of housing down. So maybe a change of heart, but I think that there will be some resistance. But again, if you think about the list of states I was going through, this is an absolute bipartisan issue. The canary in the coal mine on this, I think, was probably about 10 years ago. There was a really contentious, angry town hall meeting about rent control. And if I told you that, you'd say, okay, it was in New York City, it was in Portland, Oregon, it was in Tampa, Florida. So if they're having angry town hall meetings about rent control in Tampa, Florida, that tells you that housing is an issue everywhere.
So let's talk a little bit about the financing piece of all of this, right? So when you're constructing, you have labor as one of your costs, you have financing as one of your big costs as well. So what is it that the federal government, maybe the GSEs, could do to stimulate new construction?
Yeah, so I think that and this sort of gets into the conversation a little bit about policy and tactics. I think that the three components, the three inputs to development, as everybody here knows, there's labor, materials, and cost of capital. I kind of include land and materials. And what are the parts of that the federal government can reasonably affect? One could argue that they can affect the labor component by reducing the burden of regulation, and you don't have to spend as much time filling out paperwork. Or if you changed, and a lot of people would point to this, NEPA, the National Environmental Protection Act, puts a lot of requirements on developers and slows things down. Time is the enemy of all developments, as people know. So there's maybe the labor component could be affected a bit in that way. Not much they can do on materials, really, but where they really can have an impact.
Or maybe other than through tariffs.
Well, it could go the other way, correct. But where they can really have an impact, I think, is in lowering the cost of capital for development. And there's a debate about this. Would you target it to affordable and workforce? I personally would. Some people would argue all supply is good. It doesn't matter, lower the cost of capital. But the way that would be affected, there's a couple of ways. One would be there's a proposal out there to get the GSEs into the construction mezzanine business, and to do so at a concessionary rate, to take some of the additional exposure from the commercial banks who would be in a senior position, and actually lower the cost of capital meaningfully enough to help deals that otherwise wouldn't work, to help them get over the finish line. There's also been some work done. It's happening right now on getting the GSEs to take more stabilization risk, which in turn enables the construction lender to lean into their advance rate and their rates. So I think there are a variety of different ways that they can be helpful, and I think that there are programs like HUD 222 D4 that could be improved and expanded, and I think there are ways to do it. I think you have to remember that there are people who still in policymaking roles and still in the system who remember the savings and loan crisis of the 80s, where in an effort to get the savings and loans to earn their way out of their dilemma, they put them into the acquisition, development, construction business, and most of them blew themselves up. So I think that there will be a lot of back and forth, and other taxpayers being asked to take undue risk, but I think there is a way for the GSEs and for HUD, but certainly the GSEs, to help lower the cost of capital for development.
And on the side of the construction of lower income properties, right, one of the key programs in the U.S. is the low income housing tax credit. So what's your view on that program, and what policy changes could be useful there?
Well, it's a wildly popular bipartisan program, and also highly inefficient. There are a lot of efforts underway right now to expand the program. I think you'd see that be one of the first things. If you think about what the incoming administration might tackle, the first thing they're going to do is a tax bill. And that tax bill will have, one of the things I'm pretty sure will be in it is an expansion of the LIHTC program, and maybe some of the other programs. There are groups like BPC that are trying to make sure, and others that are trying to make sure that they commit themselves to reforming and making it as efficient as possible. As an example, this is everybody's favorite piñata, would be the cost of affordable housing in California. It costs over $1 million a door in San Jose to build affordable housing. How is that acceptable in any world? But the reason it's allowed to happen is because the state of California is not paying for it. We're paying for it. And so I think the incentives are messed up. I think that there's too many. You force developers to add too many layers of subsidy to get deals to work. And it's not really. Some of the developer fees are maybe a little bit high, but the reality is there's so much other inefficiency that could be squeezed out of it. So I would hope that groups like ours and others can have an influence in that process.
Right. I mean, at the same time, there's some research that shows that a lot of the LIHTC dollars go to places where the development would have taken place anyways without the LIHTC dollars as well, right? So there's sort of inefficiencies on both sides of this.
I totally agree with you, but the idea of getting the half the states where that's true to give up their subsidy is maybe a bridge too far.
So that was a lot of information about the supply side, and I think a lot of terrific ideas and a really useful overview of what's brewing as well on the policy end. What about the demand subsidies? Both the Harris campaign and the Trump campaign were talking about new first-time home buyer tax credits. You think is that a useful direction in your mind?
Go forward one slide. Okay, so if you look to the right of the great financial crisis in '09, there you see that sharp spike that we talked about before. Don't do that. Don't add demand-side subsidies. There's no need to. What we really need to do is figure out how to add supply. Any new programs that we come up with, I would not spend any time on demand side. It's politically popular. I get it. Rent control is politically popular, but it's a bad idea. I think that it would just be wasting money. The value of the house goes up. The $25,000 home buyer credit makes the value of the house go up by $25,000, and that's about it.
Yeah, which, by the way, not only then not reaches the targeted audience, it then also makes housing less affordable for everybody else.
It makes housing less affordable for everyone else. It's a wealth transfer from people that don't own houses and want to own houses to people that do own houses.
And to landowners, potentially.
To landowners,
well.
right.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so no demand subsidies, a lot of interesting ideas on the supply side. So which of these ideas do you think is likely to make it in the plans for the Trump administration?
Yeah, so I think there's no doubt that they will, they'll have a short period of time, but there's no doubt that they will try to, that the Trump administration will try to get some housing initiatives going. As I said before, the tax bill is going to be the first thing they take on, so I think you'll see light tech expansion in there. You might also see in there, query whether it'll fit in the tax bill or not, but I think an effort to release the GSEs from conservatorship after 16 years. The Treasury has a big embedded gain in their warrant position, and that could be viewed as something that could pay for housing initiatives or could just be an offset to other deficits. I think you'll see an effort to remove the private activity bond cap for affordable housing, a way to enable more private actors to take advantage of tax-exempt financing to build the housing that's needed. I think you'll see an effort to release federal land for the development of housing. This is particularly relevant in the western states where the federal government is often the single biggest landowner. It's very popular with the folks in Utah, Spencer Cox, the governor, and Mike Lee, the senator there. I think that'll get some traction. And I also think under the general rubric of deregulation and removing barriers to development and DOGE or whatever they want to call it, I think you'll see efforts to look at NEPA. Does NEPA pose undue burdens in the development process? Maybe continue the effort to provide financial incentives to reform zoning. I think that tension that you described before between protecting the Republican suburbs and allowing densification, the way that'll probably play out is you'll hear people talk about something like light touch density, so we can allow more single-family units per lot, or we can allow ADUs, or we can allow triplexes and duplexes and things like that. But that'll largely play out at the state level. But I think the Trump administration will try to get involved in that issue. So I expect there to be, their housing program was not as robust as the Harris administration. But if you think about it, what was the single biggest issue in the election? Inflation. People are concerned about the cost of healthcare, the cost of food, the cost of housing. The inventory of homes for sale is at historic lows. There are 30 renters for every listed home for sale, which is a record. There are more 30-year-olds living with their parents than ever before. The average age of a first-time home buyer is 38, which is the oldest ever. The Joint Center at Harvard estimated that the cost of owning a home, which would be your mortgage, your insurance, your utilities, CapEx, state and local property taxes, mortgage insurance, whatever it might be, the monthly cost of owning a home has gone up by 70% in 3 years. So yeah, this is an issue, and I think they're going to focus on it.
One item that has come up a little bit is the deportation issue, right? That presumably is going to affect, I guess the logic of that was that maybe reduces housing demand, but it probably also hurts housing supply. What's your take on that?
There's no question that probably the three things I hope housing makes it on the list as the fourth, but they're going to They're going to spend time on the border and immigration. They're going to spend time on tariffs, and they're going to spend time on deregulation. And maybe that's where a lot of the housing stuff plays out. I think at one level it was a really ingenious idea to, instead of tackle things on the supply side, tackle things on the demand side by removing residents. I just think the practicality of it is a challenge, and there's no doubt that already the administration has heard from the agricultural sector, from the hospitality sector, from the building trades. It's estimated that 25% of the construction workers in the United States aren't from here, and some portion of them, some significant portion, are probably not legal. So I think that the administration will be hearing a lot on that topic from concerned constituents.
One other topic I want to come back to briefly is GSE reform, right? So you were the CEO of Fannie Mae in the first Trump administration. At that point, there were talks about privatizing Fannie and Freddie. I think the clock ran out on the administration, right? But the plans were underway. Now with the second Trump administration, it seems likely that privatization will take place. What are your views? Like, how does this get managed? What does the housing landscape look like post-privatization?
Well, you're right to say it was derailed by the pandemic. There was a moment in April of that year, beginning of April, where we couldn't sell liabilities longer than a year. So that was an interesting time. But I think that I think there's no question that GSE reform will be on the table. It depends, the key people in that partnership are the White House, the Treasury, and the FHFA. I think that the question that is always asked is, well, if it's not broke, don't fix it. What problem are you trying to solve? And I think the answer to that question, quite simply, there's sort of the ideological answer, which is it's outrageous that if you looked at the 4 largest financial institutions in the world, one of them is the Fed, one of them is Fannie Mae, and one of them is Freddie Mac.
I joke to my students that the most socialist housing market in the world is the United States of America.
98% of every residential mortgage every year is bought by an entity that is directly or indirectly subsidized by the federal government. So we have the most heavily socialized and subsidized housing market in the world. But in any event, what problem are you trying to solve? I think in this case there's an interesting moment because we are trying to be more conscious about deficits. Treasury warrant position has a big embedded gain. The estimates are as high as $250 billion. These will be the biggest IPOs of all time, and the investor community that buys MBS, that obviously funds all of this. Big concern has always been how would they react and what would their views be on this. I think the answer to that's pretty simple. They've always relied on an implicit guarantee. They would continue to have an implicit guarantee. They would have the benefit of the preferred stock purchase agreement that would be directly available to them, and they would have an additional layer of common equity put in by private investors to protect their position. So the bond investors are actually better off. You will hear people say, "Well, I want an explicit guarantee," to which the answer is, "Well, you've never had one, and I'd like stuff too." So I don't think that there's going to be an explicit guarantee offered to them. And then the rest of the question is who's going to be in favor of it in the trades. So the MBA, the NAHB, the realtors, the National Multi-Housing Council, they will all be very, very concerned and interested in what the GSEs look like post-conservatorship. Will they be less susceptible to political pressure? The answer to that is yes. But will they reduce the brain drain? Will they be able to innovate and respond to the market in ways that they have not been able to? The answer is yes. So I think net, if it's an administration priority, they're going to take a hard run at it.
Great. So the last topic I want to discuss with you, Hugh, is especially given your current role at Vessel, is sort of this longer-term issue of construction productivity, right? So actually, I have a slide on this, which came out of a recent paper, which I thought was quite stunning. So this chart, the blue line, shows you productivity in the US economy since 1950 in every sector except for construction. And that grows by, from 100 to 250 or to 300, triples over the last 75 years, whereas the construction sector essentially is completely stagnant, right? So there's this massive gap that has opened up between the productivity of the construction sector and every other sector. So in your mind, what's behind that? And then what is your current endeavor, Vessel Technologies, trying to do about that?
Well, I think, you look at a yawning productivity gap like that, it cries out for innovation. It's the reason that the venture capital community has put so much money into prop tech and into modular development over the last few years. Combine that with a total addressable market, which is gigantic. I mean, the U.S. residential market is the same size as the equity market. It is a huge capital market. So that's why the VCs have been so interested in it. There are people that would say that the road to hell has been paved with failed modular companies. I personally think it's paved with a lot of other things, but that's a different discussion. What we have felt is that there is an opportunity to build, using panelized techniques, a system that we designed. There's two different types that people typically will talk about. One is panelized, which is what we do. Think of it like of putting together Legos, and the other would be volumetric. And there's been a lot of that, done as well. But we think it's possible to deliver units with Class A amenities at a Class B price without subsidies, affordable to people at 80 to 100% of area median income. We can go from grade to C of O in about 6 months. We can offer the system to somebody at $150,000 a door, which is substantially below traditional with the amenity package and the quality units that we're offering. And it's a really, we get asked a lot. I mean, what you're doing is so simple. Why doesn't everybody do it? I mean, the answer is I don't really know. I mean, it took a long time to put wheels on suitcases. I'm not sure why. You just have to be really, really thoughtful about every single thing that you do. And that the companies that have not succeeded in this space have tended to fail for a couple of reasons. They raise too much money for venture capitalists. They overestimated how quickly they would get to market. You mentioned the productivity statistics in the construction industry. One of the things that's embedded in there is that the real estate construction industry is extraordinarily fragmented. The two biggest players in the home market, Lennar and D.R. Horton, are probably between them 12%, 13%, something like that. And so supply chains are idiosyncratic, they're local, and most of these companies just overspent. And we've had a chance to look inside all of them, and one of them was bragging that they had a $150,000 robot that opened and closed doors, and we said we just have a person that does that. They don't cost 150 grand. So if you think back to that construct of labor, materials, and cost of capital, you have to try and optimize each one. We're saving labor in the factory. We have a vertically integrated. We're vertically integrated. We have a panel making factory in York, Pennsylvania. So we're saving labor in the factory. We're reducing waste in materials, and we are optimizing cost of capital because of the nature of what we're building. We're building workforce housing. That is something that the banks and the agencies really want to support.
Wonderful. I think we have a little bit of time for a couple of questions from the audience. So if you'd like to ask a question, raise your hand. Somebody with a mic will come up to you. It's somebody there in the middle. Yeah,
I think we need to clarify the finance. It would be nice. 5% doesn't matter.
Yep.
The problem is 7% yield on cost. Not going to happen with 7%. Not going to happen.
Well, I hear you, and I think that on the residential, on the single-family residential side, mortgage rates are what they are. 60% of mortgage holders today have a rate of 4% or less. They're not going anywhere. That's another inventory constraint. It's going to be hard on the single family. It's going to be hard on the single family side, which is why I think the emphasis on demand side subsidies in single family doesn't make a lot of sense. It's why I think that the answer is to try and do what you can to build wherever you can build more multifamily. The program that people always point to probably only does about 70,000 units a year new. It also preserves a lot. Is LIHTC. That's why I think you'll see LIHTC. You'll see LIHTC expanding. With respect to what we're doing here, we're getting the agencies. We're seeing the agencies lean in on the takeout, and I think that the conversations we're having right now are on significantly concessionary rates. That by itself, I agree with you, it helps. That by itself, I agree with you, doesn't do it, which is why you have to think about how to build for less. So let me give you an example here. We're happy to pay prevailing wage. Why? So when we're building panels in the factory, a lot of what's needed would typically be needed on site to be done with conduit and risers and things like that is done in the factory. So in this building here, when we had the union electrician come to talk to us about what the bid would be on the job, he said, well, typically I'd be bidding at 12, 13 hours per unit, something like that. He visited the site, he looked at what we're doing, and he said, I think I can do this for 2 hours a unit. We're happy to pay prevailing wage. Given what we're doing and the way we're doing it, doesn't matter to us.
Let's take one more question. So that's productivity growth, right?
That would seem to me. I mean,
yeah. Take one last question because we're pretty much out of time.
Debt to income ratios for GSE loans, but particularly for FHA loans, and I'm just looking at the AEI data, have reached historic highs. I think they're even exceeding, if you look at them in some ways, what they were in the mid-2000s. I know there's a lot of debate about how much debt to income ratios matter, but they do seem to, especially back end, have gone really high. Are you concerned about that? And if something needs to be done about that, how can it be addressed without causing a wrenching contraction in demand or an impact on markets? And I guess, kind of related to obviously the resolution of the GSEs, but just your general thoughts on that subject.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you wanted to look at the consequences of bad underwriting, you could look back at one of the charts we saw earlier in the depth of that, the recession during the Great Financial Crisis. Another useful thing to look at is in Fannie's quarterly supplement. They have the cumulative loss curves for their different vintages. And you can obviously see how dramatically different the newer vintages are from the old. I think the governor, and this is one of the arguments in favor of reprivatization, is one of the governors is making risk decisions based on the returns that your shareholders expect, rather than what some well-intended person at the FHFA might tell you they want you to do. And the concern that's been expressed about that market-based approach is that, well, geez, that'll drive up the cost of financing. I personally think that's utter nonsense. The GSEs raised, I think in 2015, raised their G fees by 25 basis points across the board. It didn't change the homeownership rate at all for the reasons we discussed earlier. And the GSEs, the G fee as a percentage of the cost of owning a house is probably about 1.5%. It doesn't change. They could double their G fees, and it wouldn't make much difference. So, I think that responsible underwriting will obviously win the day, because everybody's very aware of the consequences of the alternative.
Great. Please join me in thanking Hugh for this wonderful conversation.
Thanks for having me.